Certainly, countries that sell more of their goods abroad are better off than those that don't. But how do countries best position their economies to widen trade possibilities? Zambia, as one example, has since 1990 followed virtually to a T the 10-point plan agreed upon by the World Bank, the IMF, and the US Treasury, the Washington Consensus, for expanding the role of the market in the developing world, and sells half as much of its merchandise abroad as it did when it started. The final chapter of this book is devoted to the growing efforts to reverse globalization's course. Led by a diverse coalition that includes rock stars, Bill Gates, South Africa's gay community, college kids in the United States, landless peasants in Brazil, and Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez, the movement that has emerged in the past decade is a high-tech version of the worldwide campaign to end slavery in the Belgian Congo nearly a century ago. By providing a leg up to the poor both in his own country and abroad, Chavez has created the rarest of commodities, a government that responds to its citizenry more than to its corporate clientele. He is perhaps the most polarizing figure of the new colonial order. The model for how best to manage globalization is Chile, which has had the fastest growing economy in Latin America over the past 20 years. Contrary to conventional wisdom, it has accomplished this not by surrendering to the market, but rather by tightening regulations on business and increasing taxes, the minimum wage, and public spending on education, health, and infrastructure. What Chile demonstrates is the central fallacy of globalization. The government's fingerprints are all over the country's prolonged prosperity. The plain and simple truth is that investors from abroad will no longer rescue a sovereign nation's economy than a woman will be made whole by the attention of a man. To compete in the global economy, a country must first invest in its own workforce and industries, before outsiders rush in to assume a complementary and supervised role in economic development. It is Keynesian economics and good old common sense. Numbers provide the skeleton that gives shape to any critical assessment of globalization: gross domestic product, inflation and jobless rates, trade deficits, and mathematical formulas that measure inequality among populations. At its core, however, this is a book about jobs, decent paying jobs and the lack thereof, so it necessarily focuses on women and the darker skinned people of and from the global south. They are, after all, the world's workers. And because of the central role they play in the global economy, there is also something of the blues in the marrow of this account. Like the tango in Argentina, the blues was born in brothels to Africa's sons and daughters who put their heartache into music, a guttural wail of loss and longing. The blues are also of subversion, an act of defiance, sabotaging one's fear by singing out loud. Slaves in the American Deep South were far less likely to commit suicide than the slave owners, and the great jazz historian Albert Murray has posited that it was the blues, in its embryonic West African form, that sustained the slaves. Speak the devil's name and he loses half his power over you. In distant lands and foreign tongues, whenever ordinary people took the time to tell me their story, to describe their sorrow and their hope, I always heard the blues. This is what globalization feels like, and it is that feeling which has eclipsed Coca-Cola, Detroit's cars, and Hollywood's movies to become America's chief export to the world. The stories told in this book are based on interviews I conducted between 2001 and 2008. The seed, however, was planted in my freshman year in high school in 1979 when my Latin teacher provided the class with the origin of the word ghetto. It comes, she said, from the Italian word ghetto, which means foundry. This, as I recall, jolted me from the half catatonic trance that was my way of coping with the tedium of high school. It is part of the family lore that my father was unemployed on the day I was born. In 1965, at the apogee of the civil rights movement and America's manufacturing sector, laid off from his job at a Howard Johnson hotel, he found work 2 months later at the Chrysler plant on the west side of Indianapolis. It was a foundry that made engine blocks. The foundry, I knew even then, was a dangerous, dirty place. But along with the post office, the automobile factories and parts manufacturers on the city's west side were as good as it got for black men credentialed with only a high school diploma and a strong back. My generation was among the first to be bused to school, and so I knew that we didn't have what most of my white classmates had. Still, my mostly black neighborhood was different from the ghetto. In my neighborhood, every man went to work in the morning. We had decent clothes, food when we were hungry, and medicine when we were sick. The ghetto was a few blocks away. It was overrun with men who had nothing to do in the middle of the day. Its landscape was of forbidding high-rises and shotgun homes that needed paint. The ghetto was a place of cheap liquor, bad manners, and worse teeth. The foundry was its antidote. I became conscious of this just as American manufacturing was beginning its decline. In the early 1990s, while I was working for a Detroit newspaper, I volunteered as a mentor for a 15-year-old boy who lived on the city's poor east side. During one conversation, he blurted out, "You know, you're the only man I know who works. I know women who work, but I don't know a man who goes to a job every day." A few years later, while writing about social policy in Washington, D.C. and its suburbs, it struck me that the women I interviewed for my stories on welfare had one thing in common. All had babies from men very much like my father, demographically speaking. Only now the foundry wasn't hiring, if indeed it existed at all. In 1996, I interviewed a woman at a shelter in southern Maryland. She was poor, jobless, and the mother of an 8-year-old girl, and she was describing for me her very simple dreams for the future. She wanted an apartment, new sneakers for her daughter, and a car, because her daughter was tired of walking everywhere, and it hurt her to see her daughter walk. And there was something else, she said. "I want to see the ocean," she said. "I've never seen the ocean." From where we sat, the Atlantic Ocean was not 90 minutes away. I cannot remember her name, but I've never forgotten her face or the longing in her voice. Not a month passes when it doesn't echo in my head. The ghetto, more than anything, exists in isolation, a half-lit world where people are estranged from their homeland, citizens are unable to participate fully in the life of their city. In 2003, I was interviewing a Brazilian taxi driver who was celebrating his 46th birthday. His life was one of poverty, as was his mother's before him. He worked hard, and he worried constantly that his children would not escape the poverty he had inherited. He wanted to do so much for them, and as he drove me and my interpreter to a taxi rank one evening, he rattled off the things he would do for his family if he had just a little money: a proper wedding for one daughter, college for the other, a roof for his unfinished house, a ring for his wife of 26 years. He paused, and then, "I want to take my mother to see the ocean," he said. "My mother has never seen the ocean. I don't want my mother to die without seeing the ocean." She was at the time 59, and had lived in Rio de Janeiro all her life, her entire life. From her home, the ocean was a 20-minute drive away, due south. but it might as well have been 1,000 miles. The taxi driver usually worked 7 days a week, and if he wasn't paid a fare, the gasoline used for even a relatively short trip would mean that his wife and children went hungry later in the month. This book is for everyone who has never seen the sea, and for everyone who wishes it for them.